Welcome to the Chapter 33 lecture titled Events and Ideas. This chapter focuses on the different schools of economic thought, as well as current events that have occurred in the American economy over the last few years. The first school of thought is classical macroeconomics. Classical macroeconomics asserts that monetary policy will only change the aggregate price level, not GDP, or aggregate output. Classical economists believe that the short run is unimportant because prices are flexible, therefore making the SRAS vertical. As a result of a vertical short-run aggregate supply curve, an increase in money supply leads to a proportional rise in the aggregate price level with no effect on output, other things equal. In other words, an increase in money supply leads to inflation. The next school of economic thought started in the 1930s when classical economic theory failed to explain the Great Depression. In 1936, John Maynard Keynes presented his analysis of the Great Depression in a book titled The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. The school of thought that emerged out of the works of Keynes is known as Keynesian economics. Keynes asserts that changes in aggregate demand affect aggregate output, employment, and prices, and changes in business confidence cause the business cycle. One important difference between classical and Keynesian economics involves the short-run aggregate supply curve. Panel A shows the classical view. The SRAS curve is vertical, so shifts in aggregate demand affect the aggregate price level but not aggregate output. Panel B shows the Keynesian view. In the short run, the SRAS curve slopes upward, so shifts in the aggregate demand affect aggregate output as well as aggregate prices. Challenges to Keynesian economics. Monetarism asserted that GDP will grow steadily if the money supply grows steadily. It called for a shift from monetary policy rule to that of discretionary monetary policy. It argued that GDP would grow steadily if the money supply grew steadily. Monetarism was influential for a time, but was eventually rejected by many macroeconomists. Under monetarism, when the central bank changes interest rates or the money supply based on its assessment of the state of the economy, it is engaged in discretionary monetary policy. A monetary policy rule is a formula that determines the central bank's actions. The velocity of money is the ratio of nominal GDP to the money supply. The velocity equation, m times v equals p times y. Monetarists believed that y was stable, so they believed that if the Federal Reserve kept m on a steady growth path, nominal GDP would also grow steadily. Panel A is an expansionary fiscal policy shift of the 80 curve rightward, driving up both the aggregate price level and aggregate output. However, this leads to an increase in the demand for money. If the money supply is fixed, as in panel B, the increase in money demand drives up the interest rate, reducing investment spending and offsetting part of the fiscal expansion. So the shift of the 80 curve is less than it would be otherwise. Fiscal policy becomes less effective when money supply is held fixed. Inflation and the natural rate of unemployment. The natural rate of unemployment is also the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or NAIRU. According to the natural rate hypothesis, because inflation is eventually embedded into expectations, to avoid accelerating inflation over time, the unemployment rate must be high enough that the actual inflation rate equals the expected inflation rate. The natural rate hypothesis limits the role of macroeconomic policy in stabilizing the economy. The goal is not to seek a permanently lower unemployment rate, but to keep it stable. The natural rate hypothesis became almost universally accepted. The political business cycle. A political business cycle results when politicians use macroeconomic policy to serve political ends. Fear of a political business cycle led to a consensus that monetary policy should be insulated from politics. New classical macroeconomics is an approach to the business cycle. It returns to the classical view that shifts in aggregate demand affect only the aggregate price level, not aggregate output. Rational expectations is the view that individuals and firms make decisions optimally using all available information. The idea of rational expectations served as a useful caution for macroeconomists who have become excessively optimistic about their ability to manage the economy. According to New Keynesian economics, market imperfections can lead to price stickiness for the economy as a whole. Real business cycle theory says that fluctuations in the rate of growth of total factor productivity cause the business cycle. The theory is widely recognized as having made valuable contributions to our understanding of the economy, and it serves as a useful caution against too much emphasis on aggregate demand. But many of the real business cycle theorists themselves now acknowledge that their models need an upward sloping aggregate supply curve to fit the data, and that this gives aggregate demand a potential role in determining aggregate output. And as we have seen, policymakers believe strongly that aggregate demand policy has an important role to play in fighting recessions. There is a wonderful table on page 972 of the textbook summarizing 5 key questions about macroeconomic policy. I suggest pausing the lecture or referencing the textbook to review how the different schools of thought answer the 5 key questions. In summary, 1. Classical macroeconomics asserts that monetary policy affected only aggregate price level, not aggregate output, and that the short run was unimportant. By the 1930s, measures of business cycles was a well-established subject, but there was no widely accepted theory of business cycles. 2. Keynesian economics attributed the business cycle to shifts of the aggregate demand curve, often the result of changes in business confidence. Keynesian economics also offered a rationale for macroeconomic policy activism. 3. In the decades that followed Keynes' work, economists came to agree that monetary policy as well as fiscal policy is effective under certain conditions. Monetarism, a doctrine that called for monetary policy rule as opposed to discretionary monetary policy, and which argued, based on the belief that the velocity of money was stable, that GDP would grow steadily if money supply grew steadily, was influential for a time, but was eventually rejected by many macroeconomists. 4. The natural rate hypothesis became almost universally accepted, limiting the role of macroeconomic policy to stabilizing the economy rather than seeking a permanently lower unemployment rate. Fears of a political business cycle led to a consensus that monetary policy should be insulated from politics. 5. Rational expectations suggest that even in the short run, there might not be a trade-off between inflation and unemployment because expected inflation would change immediately in the face of expected changes in policy. Real business cycle theory claims that changes in the rate of growth of total factor productivity are the main cause of business cycles. Both of these versions of new classical macroeconomics received wide attention and respect, but policymakers and many economists haven't accepted the conclusion that monetary and fiscal policy are ineffective in changing aggregate output. 6. New Keynesian economics argues that market imperfections can lead to price stickiness, so that changes in aggregate demand have effects on aggregate output after all. 7. The Great Moderation consensus is that monetary and fiscal policy are both effective in the short run, but that neither can reduce unemployment rate in the long run. Discretionary fiscal policy is considered generally unadvisable except in special circumstances. This is the end of the Chapter 33 lecture about events and ideas. If you have any questions about the material from this chapter, please post a question in the Ask Professor Pikula discussion board or send me an email.